Meanwhile, on the island of Taiwan, support for any sort of reunification is at an all-time low. Like, it's not looking like peaceful reunification is gonna happen, which is making the interpretation of this law more and more on the side of China should do this forcibly. Okay, so that's the legal justification from a Chinese perspective. Pair that with the fact that, unlike in the 90s, China now has a massive military.
There's new concern at the Pentagon about China's military buildup.
With all sorts of new missiles.
China could soon be able to deploy a nuclear-tipped missile that U.S. defenses would find much harder to detect.
Tanks, helicopters, submarines, ships. I mean, this isn't from me, this is the US government. They recently came out with a report that said that the Chinese Navy now is bigger than the US's Navy, at least by numbers. They have 360 versus our 297 ships. Now, caveat to that data, our ships are much bigger. But still, China's recent military buildup is nuts. And this is why the US military is kind of freaking out.
My opinion is this problem is much closer to us than most think. We have to take this on with urgency.
China is upping the ante on Taiwan.
And there are fresh fears of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Taking over Taiwan remains China's #1 strategic priority.
Okay, so this is the moment that a lot of you probably came to this video for, which is, what does the war actually look like? Let's say that China feels confident that the only way that Taiwan is going to join China, which is again a legal imperative, is if they forcibly invade. Blockade isn't working, negotiation isn't working. The first strike on Taiwan would likely look like just another Chinese provocative ADIZ flyover. China's done this hundreds of times, so at this point, Taiwan thinks that they're just doing another one of their routine flex our military might exercises. But this time, the fighter jet turns towards the island and begins firing. At the same time, China fires guided missiles from the mainland and deploys tons more jets, and they all start firing in a fast, highly coordinated attack. The target here is anything that Taiwan can use to defend itself, like weapons that can shoot down planes or boats that are coming onto the island. I mean, this could be anything. Radar, communication nodes, military command centers, navy bases, bridges, communication networks, power stations, even government buildings. They would have a wide variety of targets to effectively deny Taiwan the ability to respond effectively. I mean, unfortunately for Taiwan, a lot of these targets are left out in the open. They're easy to see. A runway is really easy to see and really hard to hide. This first attack would happen very quickly. One military expert, Ian Easton, put it very succinctly when he said, assuming the intent is invasion, these attacks could be expected to be concentrated in a short time frame as a prelude to invasion with no pauses other than those required for moving, reloading, and repairing equipment. Whew. Sounds horrible. So Taiwan's leaders are caught off guard and they immediately retreat underground to a command bunker where they can plan their response. Luckily, China will not be able to take out all of their military targets. Some of their aircraft hangars are deep in mountains, and some of their missile sites are really well camouflaged. They would escape the bombardment, so Taiwan would have the ability to respond. They would likely be able to get some air power into the air and fire some missiles towards mainland China to hit air bases, radar, and military batteries on the mainland. At this point, Taiwan also sends troops to their western beaches to start laying mines and preparing for an oncoming barrage of Chinese troops who are probably now on their way across the strait. This has all happened within just a few hours, and the US is just barely hearing about this. China has likely jammed much of the communication channels that would allow the US to have a clear picture of what's going on. This will slow their response time. The thing is, China has gotten really good at sending little robots up to satellites in space, their civilian satellites, to help repair them. They could use this same technology to latch onto an American spy satellite and block its ability to view what's happening on the ground. Yes, we're now talking about conflict in space as a feasible part of this scenario. So the US is trying to get up to speed. The US president and military leaders now have to decide how they're going to respond. Are they going to risk American lives to protect this faraway island? It's something that the American public broadly would not be into. But they have to do something. They have to make a plan. Meanwhile, back over in the Strait, Taiwan's military assets are severely damaged, and China is now sending hundreds of thousands of troops and loads of supplies across this 130-kilometer stretch of water. They're using boats of all kinds, military boats, merchant boats that don't need to defend themselves because Taiwan can't respond adequately. And each of these vessels is carrying tons of supplies and troops. But again, on Taiwan's western beaches, there are probably Taiwanese troops who have been planting mines ready for this invasion. So there's now a battle on the beaches as Chinese amphibious attackers try to hit the beaches and push back the Taiwanese defense. We're going to continue assuming Taiwan doesn't give up and capitulate and surrender to China at this point. If that's the case, the US is now just starting to respond, likely from their bases in the region, Japan and Guam. They deploy aircraft carriers with jets and bombers, stealth fighters, as well as fast attack submarines that will focus on one thing: hitting all of these ships, the ones that are bringing stuff and people across the strait. Japan and Australia likely come in as allies to help out on this defense. And now the US and its allies are in direct combat with China, two nuclear nations fighting each other. This is exactly what we try to avoid because we don't know where it goes from here. We don't know where the ceiling is. War always escalates. And when there's nuclear weapons involved, that's a very scary momentum. There's even a scenario where China actually strikes first, hitting US bases in Japan and Guam at the same time that they hit their initial targets in Taiwan. This would be a much more provocative move and would certainly bring the US full force into a war with China. So now you have Chinese troops who have pushed back the Taiwanese defense on the western beaches, and they are now moving in towards major city centers. The US is fighting on the water and in the air, and from here it becomes impossible to predict what could happen next. There are so many different directions. Depending on the US's tolerance for bloodshed, there could be American troops on the ground trying to push back Chinese advancements inland. But if you look at Chinese military writings on this, you'll see that as a part of this scenario, when they're thinking about it, they're not just thinking about the US and its allies in Taiwan. They also predict that India will take advantage of this moment of chaos and invade the Himalayan borders to the south. They even foresee Tibetan freedom fighters way out here in the west who have long been hostile towards Chinese rule, rising up and taking advantage of the instability to gain back control of their region. I mean, you can see how this starts to unfold. Before you know it, the entire region is devolving into a war that threatens to engulf many more countries, hundreds of thousands of lives. And this is where I want to stop, because from here it just becomes so speculative as to be completely useless. But I tell you this scenario of a potential invasion of Taiwan, not because it's the most likely, it's actually not. The more likely situation is China will pressure Taiwan through blockades or through other painful pressures that will get them to come to the negotiating table. I tell you this because this scenario is still absolutely a possibility. What's scary to me about all of this, and I've said this a bunch, but I'm just gonna keep saying it, once something like this starts, it's really hard to reverse it, to put the cat back in the bag. No one's in control. That's a concept that's really hard to get your head around if you didn't live through a global war. We live in an international system that feels like it has rules. We have the UN, we have treaties and conventions, we have global trade. It feels like there's some sort of order. But let me remind you that that's because we live in the most peaceful time in human history. This long peace where few people alive today witnessed what it looks like when two powerful countries clash in all-out war. It usually happens when some powerful leader feels strongly that he deserves land that the rest of the world says isn't his. So he uses his big, powerful army to go take it. And in the process, he sparks a horrible tragedy. And while I hope more than anything that doesn't happen in this case, we have to remember how commonplace it is, and that the peace between these big powers is actually the outlier here. I really hope that we are past needing to resort to this version of conflict to settle our disputes at this time in our history. But I'm not totally convinced that we are yet. And I think China and Taiwan, this specific case, is the best thing to look at to test whether or not we can. We can talk about it. We can find creative ways to solve this instead of resorting to the thing humans have done forever, which is just fight each other and see who wins.